It strikes me as how, from a lifetime of travel and thought, comes to the top of my mind, there is a strange resemblance between the likes of them and the likes of us. This is a quote from Ray Bradbury's The Cold Wind and the Warm, and it offers us some interesting insight from the characters into identity and how it really isn't just plain as day. It is something that needs to be thought about and unpacked, especially when interacting with groups of different identities. Sometimes those identities can be invisible, as we've learned, and we will further discuss and unpack that later in my analysis of this short story. But first, some more about the author. Ray Bradbury was born in Waukegan, Illinois in 1920, and he grew up during the Great Depression, eventually moving to Los Angeles with his family in 1934. He there attended high school, graduated, but was not able to go to college. Instead, he relied heavily on the local library, quoted here as saying, "Libraries raised me. I went to the library 3 days a week for 10 years. That's, I think, speaks to his determination. Many may have given up in his situation, but he had been a writer since he was a young boy, and loved it and knew that's what he wanted to do, so he did it. And he went on to be one of the America's most prolific authors, writing countless books, television adaptations, and eventually, in 1953, he wrote the film adaptation for Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which brought him to Dublin in the 1950s, where he worked with the director Jim Hudson. Other notable works, most of you have heard of probably at least one of these. Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451, a book that I adored in high school, and I'm sure that a lot of us have read in high school, or at least at some point in our academic career. He also wrote The Martian Chronicles, and that is a really fun sci-fi novel, and Something Wicked This Way Comes, another coming-of-age story with some dark undertones. Speaking to Bradbury's writing style, he's very lyrical and descriptive, often touching upon emotion and appeals to all the senses in his writing. He's also a very poetic author, using similes and metaphors to convey his point and to paint a picture within his writing. He also does this through his use of fantastical language, making the ordinary extraordinary, which he does in this story, The Cold Wind and the Warm, very well. This could just be another meeting of two groups of people, but instead he takes an ordinary story of two groups of men meeting, and makes it extraordinary in the way he tells the story, as if they are visitors from afar come to a land to wreak havoc, as some of the locals might think, but that's not the case. The Cold Wind and the Warm was a short story published originally for Harper Magazine. I became familiar with it, though, in the republished by Bradbury himself in his short story collection, I Sing the Body Electric. This was a book that I actually owned before moving here. I have since given it to my father, who is also a fan of Ray Bradbury. But in there, I was familiar with it, but never read it, which is why I chose it for this project. I wanted to do a piece of work I had never read from an author that I was familiar with. So, diving into The Cold Wind and the Warm analysis, as mentioned, it's set in Dublin. Time period is unknown, but most likely it's probably set during the 1950s, since that's when Ray Bradbury himself was in Dublin. And there are themes throughout that suggest homosexuality. It's never blatantly stated, and I don't know if that was just the style of the time. Perhaps it couldn't be talked about, but nothing is blatantly stated. We're left to assume a lot, and I don't think that's a bad thing, especially in a book, in a sci-fi story. You know, science fiction has always been used to make us question and understand normal life. You take the ordinary, you make it extraordinary, because for some reason that makes it easier for us to unpack. So we have our two groups that run into each other in this story. We've got the local Dublin men, assumed heterosexual. Again, nothing is blatantly stated, and they are the dominant group. We assume they're white, Catholic, conservative, and they have no problem asserting their group identity visibly. Then, on the other hand, we have the visitors. The tourists come to see a change of scenery from their warm, sunny Sicily. They've come to Dublin in the fall, along with the cold wind. And we assume they are homosexual based on their behavior and the way they're described by Mr. Bradbury in the book. And they are the non-dominant group. And they're very ambiguous with how they assert their identity, and ambiguous in a way that they don't say it literally. They leave it up to their actions to portray their identity, and that's where some of these terms come in for understanding within the cold wind and the warm. They use signaling to reveal their identity to the local men. Signaling the way, he frills his pen out of his pocket to sign in at the hotel, or how he trills his voice when he's speaking with the pub owner. It really, they are differentiating themselves, and it's not by any means hostile or negative. They are just being who they are, and that's different to the local men who, to them, the normal behavior is what they do. They get married to, the local women. They work, they go home, they go to the pub. That's their normal routine. And here comes this group of 6 men from Sicily that just blow it all out of the water. As mentioned earlier in Module 2, we have the dominant and the non-dominant groups visible in here. And then probably the most notable terms we've learned in this class, seen in this short story, is stereotyping and othering. Stereotyping, he mentions, he tells the story of Fire Island back in the America. 10,000 men, I'm quoting here, 10,000 men came rushing down the stormy shore carrying bolts of draped material, cages full of parakeets, tomato and tangerine-colored sport coats, and lime-colored shoes. So you have these stereotypical, assumed homosexual cultural items. It's an interesting commentary on the time and to what being gay meant back then, which is, I think, very different than what being gay means today. Throughout the rest of the story, he also uses his writing style to other the visiting men from the perspective of the locals, talking about them as invaders from Venus, or the strangers from a faraway land. These are all types of othering that Ray Bradbury uses to communicate his point into how a different group was thought about. So in conclusion, this is a short story I think worth reading. It doesn't have too much to say, but it does offer us, as mentioned with the quote at the beginning, some idea of how identity can be unpacked. And in identifying others, you will find similarities that can help you understand your own identity, which I think honestly is what I took most from this story, is looking at other people and understanding that there aren't that many differences. Skin color, cultural backgrounds, all really kind of fade away when you look at the core of a being and see them as a human, and then you realize that we're all really just the same. Thank you for your time.